Hello everyone, my name is Fiona Marks and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Vedic Astrology podcast. I'm a Vedic astrologer. I'm a graduate of the Asheville Vedic Astrology apprenticeship program. I'm the host of a monthly get-together of astrology enthusiasts called Astrolojam, where we geek out over a pre-researched chart. And I am a tutor on the teachable.com Asheville-astrology course. And today I'm back with the Vedic Astrology podcast, episode 2. There are 5 topic areas to the Vedic Astrology podcast. Topic 1, I want to talk about what is Vedic astrology, and we covered this in episode 1. Topic 2 is about how does astrology work, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. The third topic of the podcast will cover delving into the knowledge and techniques of Vedic astrology, and this may become the main body of content of the podcast. Topic 4 is my love of interviewing other astrologers, hearing their stories of what attracted them to astrology, what amazes them about astrology, and what keeps them motivated, passionate, and continuously learning. And finally, the 5th topic area is case studies, where I can bring together all of these different layers of insights from Vedic astrology into a working case study and showcase what Vedic astrology can do. I hope that you will join me for all of these episodes in the future. The Vedic Astrology podcast is a new initiative, and it's a great time for you to participate. So as you listen to these episodes, if it brings up ideas for you, things that you would love to hear more about, or things that you'd like to contribute, please let me know. I look forward to a growing community of contributions. Today's topic is, how does astrology work? And as I did in episode 1, I'm going to begin this podcast by asking for forgiveness. This is an enormous topic, and no one has ever sat me down and explained it to me. But it is something that I wish that someone had explained to me, and that is why I cannot start this podcast series without attempting to do the service of explaining what is astrology, how does it work. I come to astrology late in life. It's not something that has interested me throughout other parts of my life. As a teenager, I read the occasional horoscope in a magazine, but it never resonated with me. And as a trainer, I've studied lots of personality models and used them extensively in my work, like the Myers-Briggs personality type model. But astrology was never something that I studied in that context. So I've come to astrology with no preconceived idea that it would work or that it should work. I have that naturally skeptical, inquiring mind. I come from a Western education. My majors were in chemistry and double mathematics, so I really enjoyed investigation and scientific explanation. And that's how I'm going to approach today's podcast. How does astrology work? The scientific context of astrology. One of the very first places for us to start answering this question, how does astrology work, is to look at the fundamentals of cause and effect. Does astrology work because of cause and effect? That is, do the planets that are in the birth chart cause a person's life to be a certain way? Is it the planets that are causing events to unfold? And we can see why one might be tempted to think that with astrology. Because if you've had the chance to tune into episode 1, you know how we explored the importance of the sun and the moon to ancient humans, how much the Earth's relationship with the sun means and the moon's relationship with the earth, how much those two heavenly bodies have effects here in the environment that we see every day. And as early humans are eking out a way to survive and thrive on this amazing planet, the sun had such a direct influence on the seasons around us, on the way that the plants were growing, and therefore the way the other animals were behaving and the availability of food. They're all influenced by the sun, and it's natural to think that the sun is having a direct effect on the planet and on us. Equally with the moon, we spoke about in episode 1, it's easy to observe how the moon interacts with the tides. It has a strong connection with all the bodies of water on the planet, and that can affect how early humans were able to harvest fish. These heavenly bodies provided useful information that helped humans to survive. And we noticed that the sun and the moon are going around the ecliptic, where all the other fast-moving heavenly bodies are also moving on this same ecliptic. It's quite natural for us to imagine if the sun is on this superhighway and has such a strong effect on the planet, and the moon is also there having a strong effect on the planet, then all the other heavenly bodies moving on the same highway are also having effects, direct, powerful effects, causation effects. And for all we know, this could be true. Perhaps the planets are transmitting sound or light or electromagnetic frequency or something else that we do not yet have the equipment to measure. That is how scientific discovery works. Every time we refine our instrumentation, we're able to pick up more and more subtle information. So you can imagine that before the invention of the microscope or the electron microscope, the thought that all matter was made of atoms and that inside those atoms there would be more space than stuff, that those atoms would be filled with vast areas of space, that is, the protons and neutrons didn't take up that much compared to all of the space. If you'd said that to people before the invention of the electron microscope, they may not have been able to conceptualize that because they just didn't have an instrument that would demonstrate it, that could show that level of subtle insight. And this goes for all the developments that you and I are able to exploit today. We've been lucky enough to live in a time where technology has progressed so much. You can think about all the different advances that have occurred in your lifetime. This is a little bit of a tangent, but I remember growing up watching a cartoon called The Jetsons. And on this cartoon, they would make video calls to each other, and I thought that was amazing and mind-blowing. And now, after a year of COVID, how many hours have we all spent in Zoom video calls? To get back to the topic, it is possible astrology is based on cause and effect, and we just have not invented instruments that would pick that up. What might be a light vibration, as Jyotish is the study of light. Maybe it's a sound vibration. We've just had a probe go past Venus and pick up a sound that was produced by the planet. Maybe it's an electromagnetic signal. Recently, there have been some insights into how birds migrate using the Earth's magnetic field, and the bird's eyes having a special chemical that can respond to the magnetic field. Quoting here from the BBC, clues to how birds migrate using Earth's magnetic field. Professor Hoare from Oxford University said the mechanism they have been investigating involves magnetically sensitive chemical reactions initiated by light inside the bird's eyes, in their retinas to be precise. It looks possible, and I would put it no stronger than that at the moment, that these highly specialized chemical reactions could give the bird information about the direction of the Earth's magnetic field and in that way constitute a magnetic compass, he explained. Also from Quantum magazine, an article entitled Social Mitochondria, Whispering Between Cells Influences Health. This article discusses whether mitochondria are communicating using electromagnetic signals. Or perhaps it could be a gravitational phenomenon. We certainly are held here, the Earth, in our Goldilocks position, not too close to the Sun, not too far from the Sun, by those big gravitational planets, Jupiter and Saturn, so far away from the Sun. Jupiter and Saturn in a gravitational tug-of-war with the Sun, keeping us, the Earth, placed in the Goldilocks zone. So there are interactions that are happening between us and other planets and the Sun. Perhaps there will be instruments invented that will actually analyze the cause and effect. And those instruments might not necessarily be in space. They might be instruments that can measure how the body responds and communicates at subtle chemical, electromagnetic, and more levels. And these may show why astrology works. If that is the case, we're just not there yet. But that is how the scientific method has worked. Every time we make a discovery, we understand the world a little bit better. However, could it be the case that the scientific method is not the appropriate tool to use for astrology? Taking us all back to our high school science, do you remember the scientific method of having a hypothesis, designing an experiment that would test the hypothesis, then running the experiment, gathering data and seeing whether the data confirms the theory or lies outside of the theory, in which case you have to come up with a new theory. We've developed this rigorous scientific method, and it's been a wonderful thing to giving such a discipline to science and to discovery. And we've already talked about in this episode how science has advanced so much in technology and application in our own lifetime. But the scientific method is restricted to phenomena where there is a cause and effect. That's what it's best for. Whether something really causes something else. That's when we can observe and we can use data to validate or to confirm the hypothesis. But are there phenomena that are beyond cause and effect? In the body of Vedic knowledge, which we touched upon in episode 1, we spoke about how beautiful it is that Vedic astrology is the name that has been attached to this style of astrology because it ties Vedic astrology to the body of Vedic knowledge. In Vedic knowledge, there is the 3 bodies doctrine, the physical body, the astral body, and the causal body, each at a different level of subtleness. We may be familiar with the physical body, but there are also more subtle levels of existence as well. In the astral body, the causal body, and even beyond that. And how do we study things that are beyond the physical plane of existence or beyond cause and effect? I was recently reading a fascinating article in Quantum magazine, and I'll put the link in the show notes with all the other articles that we've been referring to today. And this article was called Quantum Mischief Rewrites the Laws of Cause and Effect. And it begins by outlining for us Alice and Bob, who are the stars of many thought experiments. And let's imagine that they are cooking dinner when a mishap occurs. Alice accidentally drops a plate, and the sound startles Bob, who burns himself on the stove and cries out. However, in another scenario, Bob burns himself on the stove and cries out, and that causes Alice to drop a plate. The article continues. Over the last decade, quantum physicists have been exploring the implications of a strange realization. In principle, both versions of the story can happen at once. That is, A causes B and B causes A, and they are simultaneously true. This is kind of mind-blowing for those of us who have grown up thinking that there is only cause and effect. And this article is opening us up to the idea that maybe there's another way of experiencing or understanding the experience of life. The article goes on to say that in labs in Austria, China, and Australia and elsewhere, physicists observed indefinite causal order by putting a particle of light called a photon in a superposition of 2 states. Now, what I think is really neat about sharing this article is that, referring back to podcast episode 1, the photon, being a particle of light, has a really lovely connection with the Sanskrit word for Vedic astrology, which is Jyotish, the study of light. So that's a very neat connection between this article and our podcast. Meanwhile, back to the article, the physicists then subject one branch of this superposition to process A, followed by process B, and the other branch to B, followed by A. This procedure is known as the quantum switch. A's outcome influences what happens to B and vice versa. The photon experiences both causal orders simultaneously. Finally, the article says physicists have long sensed that the usual picture of events unfolding as a sequence of cause and effects doesn't capture the fundamental nature of things. They say this causal perspective probably has to go if we are ever to figure out the origin of gravity, space, and time. This article is so powerful in introducing us to the idea that it might be okay to let go of thinking that everything is cause and effect. And in fact, the article is saying that perhaps to understand things like gravity, space, and time, we're going to have to let go of cause and effect. And what are things like gravity, space, and time, if not astrology? We take for granted that science is the study of cause and effect. It's brought great rigor to the discipline. But can we see, for example, from this article, that is perhaps also limiting us and bringing us back to astrology, maybe is not really about cause and effect. We don't have any tools to prove that yet, and maybe we never will. But is it possible to open our minds to the possibility that this will allow us to study phenomena that are occurring on subtler levels of existence, whether we're talking about gravity, space, time, and I'm wondering whether we can apply this to astrology as well. And are there other phenomena that we experience every day that are maybe beyond cause and effect? Let's run a few potential examples through our minds as a thought experiment. What about music? Music is something that transmits meaning and sentiment across cultures, race, age, gender, across humanity. We have responses to music, and other people that we've never met have the same responses to that music. Music changes a person's mood. People study better, they exercise better, they sleep better with music. Why does music work? How does music work in that way? And is it something that falls into the mysterious phenomena beyond cause and effect? And what about love? Romantic love is a human experience, many of us growing up hoping to fall in love. It's that common that it's something that perhaps most people expect will happen in their lifetime. But can science explain that? Can science explain the cause and effect of love? Can we put people in an MRI and see the cause and effect of love? Can we measure pheromones? Can we do a blood test? Can we look at hormones? Is there anything that we can say person A will fall in love with person B, or person A will not fall in love with person B? So here's a very common phenomena that many of us are experiencing that it's hard to define a cause and effect relationship of. Another common experience is thinking. I think, you think. We're all creating new thoughts in our minds. And we can go into an MRI, and what it would show is certainly areas of the brain that are being stimulated when we think certain thoughts or do certain tasks. But the way I think uniquely and the way you think uniquely, can we see a cause and effect for that? If I have the thought of an elephant made of pineapple, something that's never been thought before, and you think the same zany thought, do my neurons and your neurons look the same? Are they arranged the same? Are they in the same place? Are they unique to each of us? Would they be the same if we looked at them in an MRI? And a related example to thinking would be consciousness. My self-awareness, your self-awareness, my awareness of your self-awareness. This is maybe the defining feature of being an adult human being. Is there something cause and effect about consciousness? Science is divided on this topic, or even whether we are conscious or whether that is just an illusion. Finally, another everyday phenomena that we exploit and use that we can't explain how it works is magnets or magnetism. Here I'm going to read from an article on livescience.com called How Do Magnets Work? Physicists have some understanding of how magnets function, but the underlying phenomena to explain magnetism continues to elude scientific explanation. Exactly how do magnets work? There's a large-scale theory from classical physics and a small-scale theory from quantum mechanics. According to the classical theory, magnetic fields are clouds of energy around magnetic particles that pull or push away other magnetic objects. In the quantum mechanics view, electrons emit undetectable virtual particles that tell other objects to move away or come closer. Although these two theories help scientists to understand how magnets behave in almost every circumstance, two important aspects of magnetism remain unexplained. Why magnets always have a north and south pole, and why particles emit magnetic fields in the first place. So isn't this astounding? Magnets that you and I played with as children, that we use in everyday devices, in MRI machines, in a whole gamut of technology, including this microphone that's recording the podcast. Science can't actually explain how they work. We're able to harness the effect and exploit them, but the article goes on to say, we just observe that when you make a charged particle move, it creates a magnetic field and two poles. We don't really know why. It's just a feature of the universe, and the mathematical explanations are just attempts. So here we have something that we don't know how it works, but we do know that it does work, and we use it every day. From these thought experiments, we can see that we interact all the time with phenomena and can't answer the question, how does it work? And is astrology one of these phenomena? We can observe it, but we can't prove why it works. To summarize so far, we have explored the question, how does astrology work in terms of, is it causal? Maybe it is. If so, we need more technology. And that's been the case in the past, that technology has helped us to understand things. So it could possibly be causal, but we don't have any way to measure whatever it is that's causing it. We're also being encouraged now to maybe question cause and effect. The scientific method is great for studying cause and effect, but what is great for studying things outside the realm of cause and effect? And we've examined some phenomena that we experience that are not explainable through the cause and effect model. So this gives us some background in answering the question, how does astrology work? And I look forward to your thoughts about how you explain astrology to your friends. And if you're someone who's being exposed to astrology for the first time through this podcast, what do you think about astrology? Do you think it could be a phenomena that is beyond cause and effect? All right, so let's pivot here now to talk about the scientific objections that come up when we ask the question, how does astrology work? Generally, there are two big objections to astrology. The first one is the discrepancy between the location of the planet and the actual constellations. So we're going to talk about that. And then the second big objection is the perception that astrology is a pseudoscience. That is, that astrology is not falsifiable. Let's examine these two objections as part of answering the question, how does astrology work? The scientific context of Vedic astrology. The number one big objection to astrology is that now, if you look up in the sky, when we say in astrology the sun is in Aries, actually, if you were able to look past the sun, the constellation in the background would not actually be Aries. As we talked about in episode 1, everything is moving. We are a rock hurtling around a hydrogen explosion in the vacuum of space in a gravitational battle to get away from the sun and to be attracted to the sun at the same time. Everything is moving. The moon is moving around the earth is moving around the sun, all the planets are moving around the sun, we're in a galaxy that's moving around its center, everything is in motion. And over time, things move enough that even when they're very far away, we can see that over thousands of years they have moved. And another thing that's moving is even the earth itself. Spinning on its axis, it's wobbling slightly, and this means that from our perspective, when we look out at the zodiac constellations, they've moved. And this is often called the precession of the equinoxes. Now, astrology has two ways to handle this. One is sidereal astrology, the other is tropical astrology. So if your astrologer uses sidereal zodiac, they are actually recognizing that the precession of the equinoxes is taking place. And long ago, they calculated in a very ancient system, used a lot in Vedic astrology, lining up the zodiac signs as they were. So if your Vedic astrology uses sidereal zodiac or sidereal Ayanamsha, that has factored in the wobble of the earth and keeps the stars lined up, the signs lined up with where the constellations were when the system of the zodiac was encoded thousands of years ago, and very close to where they appear in the night sky in real life. The other way of dealing with the precession of the equinoxes from an astrology point of view is using tropical astrology, because tropical astrology is not tied to the zodiac constellations. This was something that we looked at in episode 1 of the Vedic Astrology podcast for this very reason, to make sure that as astrologers we're comfortable with where things are in the sky. And you remember, with tropical astrology, the zodiac signs are merely names for the segments of the ecliptic, and that ecliptic has not changed. No matter how much movement has taken place, we are still going around at a little bit over 364 and a quarter days for each orbit. And the equinoxes in this system stay where they are because they are updated every year with the sun hitting those cardinal points that we spoke about in episode 1. So the zodiac constellations were only ever used as markers or names. They were never literal, which means that when you pick up the star signs in a magazine, you're looking at tropical astrology, and those star signs are relating to the segments of the ecliptic, not to the actual constellations in the background. So as you can see, it is not the case that astrology doesn't work or can't work because the planets are no longer lined up with the constellations from our perspective. Either you want to be using sidereal, where the planets line up with those background stars, or you want to remind yourself what the ecliptic is all about and that the constellations are names and markers for the segments of the ecliptic. So it turns out that precession of the equinoxes is not a problem, either for sidereal or tropical astrology. And what about the second big objection to astrology? That it is a pseudoscience. And you will see that a lot if you Google it. There are plenty of hits for that phrase. And this comes down to the idea that in order to make the scientific method more rigorous, not only do we follow what we spoke about, that is the hypothesis, designing the experiment, gathering the data, and allowing the data to show that our hypothesis is most likely correct or not. The idea was we needed to add into the scientific method, is the hypothesis falsifiable in the first place? Because the scientific method relies on that. It has to be something that is falsifiable. Otherwise, what is the point? What is the point of an experiment? Because if you can't prove that it's false, then experimenting and getting data isn't going to help you out. Let's dig down into this because it takes a bit to unpack it. For example, let's go with the science of psychology. Like all sciences, it's observing phenomena, people suffering and looking at understanding how could that possibly be the case, and therefore how can we be helpful? And we create theories. But in psychology, as in other sciences, it's easy to come up with these theories, but it's hard to disprove them. It was Karl Popper who came up with the idea of adding falsifiability. He was contrasting Einstein's theory of relativity with those primordial ingredients of psychology. So here we have a quote from Karl Popper from the Farnham Street blog entitled Karl Popper on the Line Between Science and Pseudoscience. Karl Popper was reflecting on a thought experiment such as that of a man who pushes a child into the water with the intention of drowning it, and that of a man who sacrifices his life in an attempt to save the child. Each of these two cases can be explained with equal ease in the Freudian terms and in Adlerian terms. According to Freud, the first man suffered from repression, say of some component of his Oedipus complex, while the second man had achieved sublimation. According to Adler, the first man suffered from feelings of inferiority, producing perhaps the need to prove himself that he had dared to commit such a crime, and so did the second man, whose need was to prove himself that he dared to rescue the child. Karl Popper says, I could not think of any human behavior which could not be interpreted in terms of either theory. It is precisely this fact that they always fitted, that they were always confirmed, which in the eyes of their admirers contributed the strongest argument in favor of these theories. It began to dawn on me that this apparent strength was in fact their weakness. So what we're really saying here is that the way the scientific method was originally, where you designed your experiment, gathered data, and if the data matches your hypothesis, then your hypothesis is likely true. But what Karl Popper is saying is, here in the example of psychology, these two distinctly different theories, you can design the experiment, you can get the data, and they will both reinforce their own theories, even though those theories are not related to each other and could be seen as conflicting, or at least very different theories. So this is why Karl Popper suggested, if it's going to be a science, we need to be able to get some data that would not support the theory. And so the idea of adding falsifiability to the scientific method came about. But in psychology, and it turns out in other scientific fields, it's actually more difficult than you would imagine. I'm going to read some extracts now from an article from the National Institutes of Health on the US National Library of Medicine. The article is called, What Would Karl Popper Say? Are Current Psychological Theories of ADHD Falsifiable? I'm going to read for you the abstract of the article. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, is a common and highly heritable neurodevelopmental psychiatric disorder. Here we critically review four major psychological theories of ADHD: the executive dysfunction, the state regulation, the delay aversion, and the dynamic developmental on their abilities to explain all the symptoms of ADHD, their testability, and their openness to falsification. And so the article goes on and examines each of these 4 theories and has something to say about those areas, testability and falsification. And then going back to the abstract, the writers say, we conclude that theoreticians should focus to a greater extent than currently practiced on developing refutable theories of ADHD. If you think about ADHD these days, it's a well-known condition. A general layperson has an awareness of it, and it would be a common reason why a person would seek psychological services, especially for their children. And yet at the very top of this field, the 4 main theories under review for this study cannot fit into the falsifiability requirements of the scientific method. It's challenging. And in a different article on the Frontiers in Psychology, Quantitative Psychology and Measurement website, there is an article called Replication, Falsification and the Crisis of Confidence in Social Psychology. It states that replication attempts of physics experiments are rarely carried out. To the extent that they are carried out, it can be well nigh impossible to say conclusively what they mean, whether they are successful, that is, showing similar or apparently similar results to the original experiment, or unsuccessful, that is, showing different or apparently different results to the original experiment. If even replications in physics are sometimes not conclusive, as H.M. Collins of Cardiff University has convincingly shown, then what hope is there for replication in psychology? So here we have this article, which is quite extensive. I'll put it in the show notes. I look forward to you examining it. Even in something that we think of as being as predictable as physics, when they go to replicate studies, sometimes we find data that doesn't back up the theory, or comes up with completely different data than the theory suggested. So you can imagine if that's a problem in physics, it's definitely going to be a problem in psychology, and it's obviously going to be a problem in astrology as well, which is why astrology gets called a pseudoscience, because it can't be falsified. But it turns out that in psychology and physics, they have problems with being falsifiable as well. And a final article I want to quote for this part of the podcast is from a psychologist from the London School of Economics, Satoshi Kanzawa, and he reminds us that there really is no such thing as a scientific proof. In his Psychology Today article, Common Misconceptions About Science 1, Scientific Proof, Why There Is No Such Thing as a Scientific Proof. In the article he states, proofs exist only in mathematics and logic, not in science. Mathematics and logic are both closed, self-contained systems of propositions, whereas science is empirical and deals with nature as it exists. Proofs have 2 features that do not exist in science. They are final and they are binary. In contrast, all scientific knowledge is tentative and provisional, and nothing is final. There is no such thing as final, proven knowledge in science. The currently accepted theory of a phenomenon is simply the best explanation for it among all available alternatives. And this reminds me of an Australian example. You can imagine that for hundreds of years, Europeans had observed a bird called a swan. And swans in Europe are always white. It's easy to imagine that there is something quintessential to being a swan that involves it being white. But then, when Europeans discover Australia, just like that, they find the same bird, but it's black. There are black swans in Australia. So hundreds of years of observation, data collection, replicability over time, that swans were white is just wiped out in an instant by a new piece of empirical data. The real world, where all science is based on observation. There's not any watertight proofs, there's just the most likely explanations for the data that we've observed. So where does this leave us? Let's just be clear and say that There are definitely things in psychology that are measurable, and if you want to say in inverted commas, provable. And they are all on the intervention side of psychology. For example, with cognitive behavioral therapy, there can be a study with a specific number of participants that had a certain number of results that improved people's experience by so much of a percent. So there are definitely things in psychology that are scientifically studyable, countable, and measurable. But even if you look at cognitive behavioral therapy on the NHS fact sheet, that is the National Health Service of the United Kingdom fact sheet, it says right up at the front, cognitive behavioral therapy is based on the concept that your thoughts, feelings, physical sensations, and actions are interconnected, and that negative thoughts and feelings can trap you in a vicious cycle. So even in medically or psychological health information for the public, we are saying that these are theories. And astrology is obviously like this as well. If you see an astrologer, they're going to raise your awareness about patterns in your life, and they're going to give you homework. If you come and see a former life coach like me, it's going to be literal homework. But maybe if you see a different Vedic astrologer, they're going to suggest you do mantras or make a regular practice where perhaps you fast on a certain day of the week, or perhaps you make a donation, you sacrifice some of your time, some of your money, some of your belongings, you make a donation to an organization or a charity. And what are those things really? Mantras, fasting, making a donation? Similar to cognitive behavioral therapy, they are circuit breakers. They're going to change your behavior. They're going to remind you to stay aware that this is a pattern that I want to change. And every time this pattern happens, I'm going to think and notice that this is a pattern that I want to change. So we're not talking about whether it works or it doesn't work. We're just talking about how does it work. And if the theories of psychology, or even in some cases physics, are not falsifiable, can we be open to realizing that there are in fact things that we take for granted that are science, for example, going to see the psychologist about ADHD, that we think are scientifically backed, that the theory is inverted commas proved, but in fact at many levels of psychology and in other sciences, we perhaps haven't had that falsifiability and replication standard of rigor and investigation that we might expect from the scientific method. And if we're going to be okay with that, can we be okay with astrology? Let's sum up the journey we've been on in this podcast so far. Where does that leave us now in answering the question, how does astrology work? We've had a look at cause and effect. Maybe there is a cause and effect. If so, we need instrumentation that we haven't invented yet. We've also touched on how physicists are beginning to acknowledge that cause and effect might not describe reality well, and may be limiting our perception and our ability to solve problems about space, time, and gravity. We've also looked at phenomena that we experience all the time that either we don't have an explanation for, or that are maybe happening beyond cause and effect. We've talked about music, love, thinking, self-awareness, and magnetism. And it turns out we can't explain how magnets work, and maybe astrology is one of these phenomena too. We've also examined two of the major objections people raise about astrology when they try to understand how it works. The misalignment between the planets and the constellations, and we've also looked at the pseudoscience label that astrology has because astrology can't be falsified. But we've actually examined that in psychology and even in physics, there are theories that either can't be falsified or struggle to be replicated. To sum it all up, we don't know how astrology works. It could be a mechanism that we can't observe yet. It could be that astrology is one of many phenomena that we harness the power of that we don't know how they work. Even something as beneficial as cognitive behavior therapy is well researched in its effectiveness, but remains based on a theory that is not proven. And this reminds me of an experience that I had when I moved to a country town at the age of around 12 years old. The town was filled with hydrangeas. I don't know whether you've ever seen these plants, but they're big bushes, and at particular times of the year they just burst forth in flowering leaf clusters of pink or blue. And I would ask about these spectacular bushes and flowers and be told that if you put rusty nails in the soil under the hydrangea, its flowers will be blue. Wow, that's amazing. And obviously people were doing that all over the town and it worked. And everyone assumed that it must be the iron in the rusty nails. So that's what's causing the plant to go blue. But it turns out that it's got nothing to do with the iron really, that the rusty nails in the right condition can be acidic enough to make the soil just that little bit more acidic, which will release the aluminium that is bound in the soil. When the soil is alkaline, it holds on to the aluminium. So it's got to do with aluminium, not with iron. If the rusty nails are doing anything, they're tipping the balance to be more acidic, and this releases what was already there bound in the soil. And who knows, maybe it is also like this with astrology. Maybe we think it's got to do with planets and signs, or maybe it's like the rusty nails. It's something that works, but it might not be the cause. Finally, when I was doing research for this podcast about magnets, I came across a blog post by Tim James, an author and maths teacher. The blog post was called, "Is Magnetism Impossible to Explain?" And to finish his blog, he said that sometimes he imagines human knowledge as a tree. And at the moment, science is built on a few main boughs of this imaginary tree. And we haven't yet unified them into a single trunk. But when we have done so, the trunk will extend down as far as we can go, maybe even connecting to other universes or different laws. And magnetism is one branch of this tree of knowledge. We can observe its effects and we want a deeper explanation, but we just haven't united that tree yet. And I love this because going back to episode 1 of the Vedic Astrology podcast, Vedic knowledge and Vedic science works the other way around. It works from the trunk out into the branches. It has the unified field. It has the unified answers to these questions, and it sees how everything is connected. Whereas in science, as this teacher has experienced, we come from the twigs and the leaves and we're working our way towards the branches and trying to find where the trunk is, and we just haven't done that yet. So I think this leaves us with the wonder that is all of us have in the natural world. It reminds us of how many things we still don't understand. And the great gift of this is its awesomeness. It inspires awe in us. And maybe that is the role of astrology, to connect us to the awesomeness of how big the universe is, and thinking about those other non-cause and effect thought experiments. Love connects us, it's awesome. Music is awe-inspiring. Consciousness is the ultimate awe. And maybe magic magnetism is as well. Astrology is in good company with these awe-inspiring phenomena that we're tapping into, we're harnessing, but we just don't understand everything about these phenomena yet. I hope you have enjoyed this journey through answering the question, how does astrology work? The scientific context of Vedic astrology. I think it's something that we're going to come back to over and over again. I'm hoping that this podcast had useful insights for you, that it was thought-provoking, and whatever you would like to share about the way you understand how astrology works, I'd love to hear from you. I'm looking forward already to the next time we get together for the Vedic Astrology podcast. And until then, stay well.